Some of you might have been there. And I think that I said last year that we were closer, that I had good news. And I asked you if you wanted to hear my good news, and you say yes, and I say we're closer to our recovery today than what we were yesterday. I'm still using the same line 1 year after. But it's a truism. It's always true. We are closer to our recovery. And you have to be at ease, because Washington politicians are working hard to make our lives better. That was supposed to be a joke, right? But, I am trying, I'll try to make, there are many things that have happened during the last year. I am a market economist. I do not believe that the government has to do everything. Just to give you an analogy, every time I hear that the government wants to do something, intervene in the economy, I remember a silent movie. Who has seen silent movies? That will show you age, but at the same time, it will help me explain what I'm talking about. I remember this scene. I think that this guy, Wilder, was trying to get a soda, a pop from the machine. You remember that machine? He puts the money and waits for the can of Coke or a soda to come down, and he sees that the machine shoots one can of Coke through a hole in one of the sides of the machine. So he puts another coins in the machine and puts his left hand on that hole. And puts it, and the Coke, the next can of Coke goes out through the other side hole. So he puts his two arms, puts the money, and you know where the can of Coke came out through the normal place. So that was silent, so we couldn't do it. But I remember in the cinema, everybody went, oh! So this is what happens when governments start micromanaging the economy. They fix one hole, and many other holes appear. And this is what we are suffering today. I'm convinced that market economies are much better than government intervention. But of course, last year we faced a very serious issue. No markets were working. But it was a failure of policy. Why? Because I am convinced that allowing Lehman Brothers to fail was the worst mistake since the 1920s. Because it pushed the U.S. economy and the world economy into an uncharted territory. And we are just starting to recover from that as we move along. So let me show you what has happened during the last year. And this is what has happened. The U.S. economy went into a recession. And because of government intervention, we are growing back again. The third quarter of this year, GDP growth was 3.5% annualized rate. Of course, nobody's feeling this recovery. Why? I always say that the U.S. economy is still in intensive care. We have an IB, it's called the U.S. Treasury Department. In the other arm, we have another IB, it's called the Federal Reserve. And this is how we have been able to survive during the last year. And this is how we were able to achieve a 3.5% growth. My biggest concern is sustainability. I do not think that economic growth in these conditions is sustainable. So, this is the biggest issue that affects consumption, and affects the housing market, the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate closed at 10.2% in October. And I am sure that it's probably going to hit 11% before all is said and done and the economy starts recovering. The biggest issue with the unemployment rate is that the unemployment rate is a lagging indicator. Even as the economy recovers, the unemployment rate is going to continue to go up. So we still have some way to go in terms of unemployment. You can see the comparison. If we compare this recession to the 82-83 recession, it is very clear that we got to almost 11% unemployment rate back then, and we are not even close to 11% yet. I mean, very close, but not close enough. And the 1982-83 recession was not even close to the recession that we are experiencing, or to the problems that we are experiencing today. So my best guess is that the U.S. unemployment rate is going to get to 11% by the middle of next year. And probably it will start going down after that. This is what happened last year in terms of employment. You can clearly see that there's a break here. The U.S. economy was in recession up to September of last year, but it was a controlled recession. Then Lehman Brothers was allowed to go under, and hell broke loose. And the worst one, we destroyed almost 800,000 jobs. This was January of this year. So after the Lehman Brothers fiasco, things really got out of hand. And this is one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve and the Treasury had to do what they didn't do before, just recover or try to prevent a major collapse. I mean, you know that the Federal Reserve is in charge of financial stability, is in charge of keeping prices low, is in charge of keeping unemployment low. So they failed everything. Nothing was right. Everything was wrong at that time. Of course, I would never have wanted to be in her shoes. That's why I can't speak freely about it. But, you know, initial claims for unemployment are still very high. 520,000 per week. In order for the economy to be recovering, this number has to be at 320,000 per week. We're still 200,000 new jobless claims per week. And that is a clear sign that the economy, even though we had a 3.5% growth rate in the third quarter, nobody's hiring. And in order for this economy to grow sustainably, we have to bring down the unemployment rate, and we have to bring down this number. If you remember last year, before the collapse of Lehman Brothers, we were concerned about inflation. Inflation was almost 6% per year over year last year. Now, because of the crisis, we have a deflation. Prices are negative. The same thing happened to producer prices. Whoops. Producer prices were at almost 10% year over year. And now they are minus 4% because of the crisis. So there's a lot of talk that the U.S. economy is very close to a depression, a deflationary environment. And I agree. I mean, there was a possibility that we might go into a depression last year and into a deflationary spiral. But, you know, I have likened the U.S. economy to Humpty Dumpty. And I call the U.S. economy the Humpty Dumpty economy. Why? Because as I said before, the Federal Reserve believed that the economy was going to fall apart last year. So this is, remember the lines for Humpty Dumpty? Humpty Dumpty, Humpty Dumpty, all the kings. Well, I changed those lines. I say the U.S. economy sat on a wall, the US economy had a great fall, all the king's treasury men and all the king's Federal Reserve men could not put the US economy together again. Why do I say this? I say this because I think that the US economy is walking on this very narrow brick wall, on top of this brick wall, and it could fall from that wall. The Federal Reserve believes that we are going to fall to this side of the wall. And what we are going to face is a depression like Japan is facing since the 1990s, or a depression like we faced in the 1930s. However, because I believe that the Federal Reserve is going to be successful in its attempts to prevent a depression, an inflationary spiral, I believe that the US economy's major risk is that we are going to fall to the other side of this wall, which is inflation and stagnation, which is what we went through during the 1970s and 80s. I think that this is the biggest risk for the US economy, and I will tell you why in a short while. So, you know, whenever a central banker is told that, or believes that an economy is going to go into a depression, into a deflationary spiral, monetary theory says that central bankers have to get into helicopters and start throwing money out of the windows. So, one of the researchers, the top advisors to Greenspan, back in 2001, when we dropped the interest rates to 1%, was Ben Bernanke. Ben Bernanke was one of the governors of the Federal Reserve when Chairman Greenspan was at the helms of the Federal Reserve. So he was saying that at that time that the world economy there was a high risk of the US economy going into a depression and into a deflationary spiral. So he recommended the Federal Reserve or the Federal Reserve bankers to get into helicopters in order to throw money out of the window. So I went to the internet to try to look for a helicopter. So here is helicopter Ben to the rescue. You should have heard the helicopter, but anyway, next time. You can invite me next time and you will hear the helicopter. So this is Ben Bernanke action figure. It says, now you can drop money out of the helicopter, but there's a warning down there. It says, cannot really prevent a severe recession from happening. So back in 2001, we were very close to recession, to depression, according to the chairman. So the Federal Reserve chairman dropped interest rates to 1% and left those interest rates at that level for 1 year. What did they do that for? Well, they did that in order to reflate the economy. Instead of prices going down, you will push prices up. Did it work? Yeah, only one price increase. Home prices. So we created the mother of all bubbles, and it burst into us. And this is what we are suffering today. So basically, here is the rescue plan. I hope that you are seated and you are grounding your chair. This is the rescue plan. $11 trillion have been committed to saving the US economy from collapse. And I am not saying that that shouldn't have happened. I think that they had no choice. But this is how bad things got last year. You know, GDP, US GDP for 1 year is $14 trillion. So we have almost 11 trillion in order to produce 14. There's no return on investment here almost. This is how bad things got last year. These are all the programs that have been put out by the Fed and the Treasury. Of course, not all of it has been spent. Only 3 trillion has been spent. But this is the reason why I believe that at some point in time, all this money is going to start making its rounds. across the US economy. And at that point in time, the Federal Reserve will have to start hiking interest rates very fast if we don't want to have a serious inflationary issue. So, up to today, this inflation is not a problem, but whenever banks, you know, we as banks have a serious problem. Other than we survived this so far. The problem is that politicians want us to lend. And politicians want us not to lend. They want us to recapitalize, but at the same time they want us to lend. So it doesn't work both ways. You either recapitalize or you lend. Having said that, we are lending. The problem is that nobody is borrowing. And those who are trying to borrow cannot pay back. So the government wants us to go back to pre-2006 or 2007. But we are not going to go there. Nobody is going to go there, at least in the short term. You know, everybody forgets about these things, but at least so far, nobody's going to go there. But anyway, the Federal Reserve has been intervening in the Treasury in all these markets, MBS markets, commercial paper markets. So, from being the lender of last resort, it has become the lender of first resort. If the government is not, if the Federal Reserve is not lending, then there's no lending happening. And that is very, very serious. So what is the state of the economy after this? The housing market has reached a bottom. And it seems that to be slowly getting out of this bottom. But it will be very, very hard. You know, one of my biggest criticisms of the government, of the plans the government has put out, is that we cannot keep on giving money to people to spend. Because it makes no difference. They will get the money, spend, and that's it. They are not going to spend on their own. So they are sitting down, waiting for the government to give them money. This is what is happening in the housing market. The market is moving, but it's only moving because of the $8,000 first-time homebuyers credit. They just extended that money, I think, that until April of 2010. And that is going to keep prices and the home market from continuing to go down. But it is not going to be able to refloat or make the market to recover. You can see very clearly that even though inventory of new homes has dropped to almost 8 months, we are still very high compared to historical standards. Housing starts are still very, very low. Building permits also. Existing home sales are very, very high or have recovered considerably. This is basically because of the first-time home buyer's credit, $8,000 for your first home. So this has pushed the home market higher, but the biggest issue is that if you don't keep those $8,000, it is not going to be sustainable. Existing, and you can clearly see why. Look at, this is inventory. This is historical number of months of inventory of existing home sales. 4.5 months. We are right now at 8 months. Twice as much as historical average. So that means that there's plenty of homes out there that if these credit disappear, the housing market is going to go down again. The best news in terms of housing market is home prices. Because of this help coming from the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury, home prices have stopped their drop and have come up in many, many places, with the exception, of course, of some California markets, Las Vegas, and so forth. But there are some markets that are recovering because of all this help coming from Washington. The rest of the economy is doing a little bit better. This is the manufacturing index. Any number above 50 means that the manufacturing sector is expanding, and you can clearly see that we have had 2 consecutive months of above 50 for this measure. Some of this is cash for clunkers. So we are expecting this number to start going down in the next couple of months. The non-manufacturing sector, this is the best news that I have for you. This is the best news because the non-manufacturing sector, which is 90% of the US economy, for the first time had a positive number last month. It is not a great number. Actually, the second time, we were at, I think that 51.5, and then it dropped to 50.6 in October. So it is positive, it is expanding, but at a very slow pace. But those are good news for the US economy. The biggest issue is the consumer, because the only way that this economic recovery is going to be sustainable is if the consumer recovers. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. Why? Because of unemployment, because of the massive amount of losses in terms of wealth, which have prompted the consumer to start saving again, finally saving. So now we remember that we complained, or we heard complaints for like 10 years or 15 years that the US consumers were not saving. Now that they are saving, nobody wants them to save. Politicians want them to consume and consume and consume and consume until death do us part. So this is the biggest issue. Credit is very, very limited. You know, everybody blames the banks, correct? It's an easy target, especially when you see some bonuses around there. But it's a very populist way of going around. Accuse the banks. But the problem here is that half of the banking industry is no longer here. The amount of money that has been lost since last year is so humongous that there's nobody, very few that have any ability whatsoever to lend. So half of the industry has been decimated, and the other half of the industry is not able to produce what the economy needs right now in terms of credit. Before the crisis, the investment banking community was providing 80% of the credit to the US economy. Now that industry is nowhere to be found. And they wanted commercial banks, and we were commercial banks. We did not have investment banks, an investment bank last year. Now we do have, because we bought Wachovia, and Wachovia had an investment bank. But last year, this year, half of the industry exists. So we are not capable of lending as much as before. Consumer confidence is very, very weak, even though the economy seems to be recovering. And this is personal income. I always like to show this graph because you know what this was, no? This is personal income. I just want to make a case. You are very close to this number because it came from Seattle or from Washington State. This was December of 2004. What happened in 2004 in December? Microsoft paid dividends. These were the 3 tax rebates. So you can see how big of a difference the private sector does versus the US government. So that's why I'm a fan of the private sector rather than the US government. But anyway, personal consumption, very weak, and then we had cash flow clunkers. And after cash flow clunkers, whoops. I would have called that program cash for clunkers the other way around. Clunkers for cash. You know, right now, having saved Chrysler in the 1970s was the worst mistake of the U.S. policymakers have made. After Lehman, of course. Because at that time, the market was telling us that the US market did not need 3 large automakers. We saved Chrysler, and we threatened GM and Ford. Of course, they have their own fault, but at that time, the market was telling the US economy that we did not need 3 US large automakers. Had they not saved Chrysler, GM and Ford might have put their act together and have survived this. Nobody knows, of course. It's just something for you to think about. But this is what is happening. After spending ourselves to death with a savings rate of almost 0%, we have been fast increasing our savings rate over the last year. This is really bad for the short term, but it's great for growth sustainability in the medium to long term. Of course, if you're a politician, you will not be re-elected with these numbers. So that's why they want to throw money so you can consume instead of save. But right now, consumers are saving and will continue to save. Why? Because they also know that taxes are going to be higher in the future. So in order to be able to pay higher taxes in the future, to pay all this mess, they are saving even more today. So, again, retail sales went up. Why? Cash for clunkers. And then they came back down. Let's look at the financial market. And this is the worst financial crisis that we have experienced since the 1930s. Even in the 1930s, last year's crisis was even worse than in the 1930s. At some point in time in November of last year, by this time, US Treasury paper, 3 months papers, were paying negative interest rates. What does that mean? It meant that investors were bringing the money to the government and say, I'll lend you this money and I'll pay you on top of that. This is how bad things got in the financial market. So look at what has happened to loans. This is loan growth. Year-over-year rates, negative 17%. So this is bad. This is bad for growth sustainability. Banks are not going to have the largesse that they had in the previous years. So don't expect the happy times, the vida loca that we used to live before 2007 to come back anytime soon. So the Treasury yields look fine. Look at the 30-year mortgages. 30-year mortgages have trended down for the last year and so. The 10-year Treasury is trending up, so that means that higher interest rates for mortgages are coming. So if you wanted to buy a home, this is the best time to buy a home. Of course, you need the money. If you don't have the money, you have to borrow, and it's a tough environment to borrow right now. But you will never have such low home prices as today, and such a low mortgage interest rate as today. So if you are planning to buy a home, go now. Because this is not going to be repeated unless we have another cataclysm, of course. But look at what happened. This is the spread between the 10-year Treasury and 30-year mortgage. It measures the risk associated with lending in this market, correct? So you can see that after Lehman Brothers, the spread increased to 300 basis points. Once the Federal Reserve intervened and started borrowing or taking MBSs, mortgage-backed securities, the risks have come down. But that is only because the owner of the printing press is lending. Correct? So what would happen when the Federal Reserve gets out? I don't want to know. Will they be able to get $1 for dollar per dollar? I don't think so. They will probably get 20 cents for each dollar. So we will have another crisis at that time. But anyway, they'll figure it out. Federal Reserve bankers are paid, I don't know, very low rates. I mean, low in comparison to Wall Street investment bankers. 180, I think that Denver Mankiw earns $180,000. Of course, he has lots of other goodies, but I would never accept $180,000 to undo what they did last year. They will have to pay me big, big time. So anyway, I won't go there anyway. But commercial paper, the same thing. This was Lehman Brothers. After Lehman Brothers, then the Federal Reserve intervened, and it's the only one lending in this market. The U.S. Federal Reserve, from being a lender of last resort, has transformed into a lender of first resort. And those are the biggest risks that we have today. What would happen when the Federal Reserve has to get out and start selling all these commercial paper and MBSs to the market? That is when things are going to get bad. Hopefully not, but All right. Corporate bonds risk have come down, but they have started to increase again. LIBOR, this is the best news that we have. The LIBOR rate. Why? Because the LIBOR rate determines the interest rates on ARMs, on adjustable rate mortgages. So the biggest figure last year was that if the LIBOR spread was so high, interest rates on ARM resetting was going to set the home market, the ARM market, to a tailspin. This is no longer a threat right now because that spread is back to normal levels. So that means that if you have an ARM and it's going to reset, interest rates resetting is going to be very low. Even, in some cases, even lower than what you had. So that's a good news for the ARM market. I am mentoring a Wells Fargo worker, employee, and I am teaching him exchange rates. I am just helping him understand exchange rate movements, which I don't understand, of course, but since I have a PhD and he doesn't, I am the one that has to explain. So he's reading a book and we are discussing this book. And this author says, well, the US dollar has been trending upwards. Not like the Japanese yen, that it has appreciated considerably. The US dollar hasn't moved, actually. I don't know what graph he was looking at, but if you take a long-term perspective of the US dollar, this is the trade-weighted dollar. So this is a weighted measure of the US dollar versus the countries with which we trade, the largest countries with which we will trade. And you can clearly see that there's a clear downward trend for the US dollar. Of course, we have sporadic appreciation periods, and you can clearly see that it's very curious because this appreciation period was before the 1982-83 recession. And this appreciation period was before this crisis. But the overall trend for the US dollar is very clear, and it's going down. So I think that this is the biggest threat for the world economy, because oil prices will remain high. I have been a fervent believer in gold for the last 6 years. So if you heard me 6 years ago, you would have not lost a penny in this market. Of course, I never bought gold myself, so I did lose 50% of my 401k. But you know, as the parent says, do what I say, not what I do. So this is the biggest threat for the world economy, because it will keep commodity prices high, and it will keep oil prices high, and that will potentially create higher inflation. The most interesting thing last year was that whenever the crisis hit, remember the US dollar depreciated up to here last year before the Lehman Brothers. And after that, instead of depreciating further, it appreciated. So this is when everybody came back to the US in a desperation and fear, and basically put all the money, gave all the money to the government. And that's why we have negative interest rates for short-term paper from the US government. But the trend of the dollar is worrisome. So what are my summary conclusions after this depressing speech? Housing market shows signs of bottoming. The US economy and the world economy are in recession, but in the recovery stage. The probability of a double dip is very high. Why? Because whenever the US economy starts growing again, the Federal Reserve will have to start to mop all this excess liquidity. And that is going to push interest rates higher. That will push the housing market lower. And the US economy is going to go into a recession again. So this is the biggest risk that I see today. Inflation remains a medium and long-term concern, at least for me. Nobody else believes me, but you know, I don't care. The financial system is starting to work, but it's still limiting the effectiveness of monetary policy, and fiscal policy is the only alternative. I criticize it because I think that we are doing it wrong. I think that we should use all the money that we are spending in education, in retraining of the labor force, in helping the economy to be more productive in the future, not helping people consume today. So that is why I criticize policy. But it's also going to be very expensive. We're going to pay for this for many, many decades, and probably more than that. So, you know, as a very good friend of mine says, every time I explain something to him, he says, "Okay, thank you very much. I'm still confused, but at a higher level." Thanks.